In May of 2012, I was undertaking a 5-hour drive from Glasgow to the northern tip of the Highlands for the Ullapool Book Festival. I was a doctoral research student and had received a small bursary to attend, but due to my teaching duties that week, I found myself driving up alone fairly late on a Thursday evening. It wasn't a terribly long drive, but having left the city after 8 PM, I found myself tiring around the Cairngorms and decided it was safest if I pulled over for a catnap. At the time I was driving my beloved old Mini and had a bit of an embarrassing affection for all things retro. I was therefore carrying a ridiculously old Nokia mobile with the battery life of a Spinal Tap drummer and absolutely no internet capability. I had pulled over into one of the parking areas of the National Park at Aviemore, where I specifically chose one of the smaller car parks that acted as an access point for hill climbers. These areas permit overnight parking, are generally off the main road and are unlit, which I thought would best facilitate a quiet rest before I started driving again. What with it being Scotland, it was raining lightly and the air was chill. I lowered my seat and pulled my coat over me, drifting off fairly quickly as the rain drummed pleasantly on the roof of the car. I woke with a start sometime later. I was in darkness, slightly disorientated, and vaguely aware that I had heard a thump somewhere on the bodywork of the car. The combination of chill outside air and my warm breath inside had fogged the windows, and I couldn't see out. I was by no means panicking, sure that it had just been the metal chassis settling as the engine cooled, and I picked up my mobile to check the time. I was cursing slightly under my breath about the fact that my battery had died when I heard a distinct tap, tap, tap on the lower side of the passenger door. I was unnerved, and I reached across the seat to check the door was locked. Do you ever talk to yourself when you're nervous? I certainly do, and I was quietly chiding myself for being a baby when the tap, tap, tap sounded from the rear passenger panel. I immediately shut up and stared at the back window. No movement, no shadows. A bit exasperated with myself, I switched on the engine, turning the hot air on to clear the windows. I would have preferred to sleep a bit longer, but my nerves had me wide awake, and I decided I'd be as well making tracks. It took an age for the windows to clear. Always did with my old Mini, thanks to a bus fan on the passenger side, and I sat for a couple of minutes before I began to see more clearly through the steam. My heart about plummeted to the floor when a brief movement in the wing mirror caught my eye. Something was lurking around the back of my car. I immediately switched on my headlamps and the car park ahead of me was flooded with light. There was no other cars, which I found comforting, assured that it must therefore be an animal I had seen in the mirror. I was restoring my seat to its normal position when something clattered deafeningly against the window by my face. I screamed on pure instinct and immediately peeled out of the car park, a thick fog still obscuring the majority of my rear windows. My heart stopped hammering about 10 miles down the road when I realised that no one was following me. By the time I reached my hotel in Ullapool, just over 2 hours later, I had decided I had most likely been hit by a bird, or possibly a bat, and had laughed at my skittishness. I got out of the car and stretched my legs in the bright car park of the hotel, enjoying the cool air after being cooped up for so long in a confined space. When I went to collect my bag from the back seat, I noticed an envelope tucked underneath and opened it with curiosity. Dear driver, you should be more careful about where you park at night. I sat in the passenger seat for almost 10 minutes and wrote this while you slept. Your passenger window can be eased down by hand. Take care. I drove home from the festival early on the Sunday afternoon, determined to make the journey in one daylight trip. I had my window checked at a garage back in Glasgow and sure enough, the locking mechanism was broken. I'll never know if my visitor thought they were being a good Samaritan or took some pleasure in frightening me, but either way, the thought of some stranger sitting on my passenger seat, watching me while I slept that night, still chills me to the bone. This incident happened to me last year on Halloween. My little brother and I were home alone, since our parents had gone to a Halloween party. They had tasked us with handing out candy to the trick-or-treaters. This bummed my brother and I out, because we had made plans to go trick-or-treating with a few friends. Our parents told us that we were too old to still be trick-or-treating, and that we could instead invite our friends over to the house and hang out there. My friends declined my invitation to come over, They still wanted to go trick-or-treating. So they left me home alone with my brother, handing out candy. A lot of people stopped by our house, and by 10 PM almost all the candy was gone. My brother and I decided that we'd eat the rest. We were sitting on the couch watching a scary movie, stuffing ourselves with candy, when there was a knock at the door. I stormed off the couch wondering who the hell could be knocking at our door this late. I assumed that it was just some late night trick-or-treaters. Even if that was the case, I'd turned the porch light and Halloween decorations off, which should have been a dead giveaway that we were out of candy or that we weren't home. I assumed it was my parents. Being cautious, I looked through the peephole and saw a suspicious man standing on our front porch. He was wearing a black hoodie with a hood over his head, which made it difficult to see his face. The only detail of his face that I could spot was that he had a beard and dry, crusty lips. There was no way that this guy was a trick-or-treater, because he wasn't wearing a costume. He was also far too old to be trick-or-treating alone. His hands were stuffed in the front pocket of his hoodie, and he also looked very thin. Every single red flag went off in my head about this guy. There was no way in hell I was going to open the door. Still looking through the peephole, I watched as he knocked on the door again. He seemed desperate for us to open the door, and was shaking a little bit. It wasn't cold outside, definitely not cold enough for someone to be trembling. He was giving me a bad vibe, and I wanted to get rid of him as soon as possible. "We're out of candy," I shouted to him. I watched as a smile spread across his face. It wasn't a friendly smile either. "Are you alone in there?" the man asked, almost in a mocking voice. His voice was raspy and dry. "Should I call the police?" my little brother asked me quietly, gripping his cell phone. The man let out a low grumble and said, "Sounds like you're not alone in there." I continued to watch him through the peephole. His hands were still wedged tightly in his pocket, and he was still shaking a bit. I began to wonder if he was armed. I decided to take action and spoke to him in the most intimidating voice I could. "Get the fuck away from my house or I'll call the police," I shouted. His smile faded and he bared his teeth. His teeth were piss yellow, and I concluded that he was probably some homeless crackhead. He had a look of fury plastered on his face. Fortunately, he left without trying to break in. Probably because he knew I wasn't fucking around with him. I didn't stop watching him through the peephole until I saw him completely off of our property. My brother and I breathed a sigh of relief and decided not to call the police. My brother and I were a bit paranoid after this and watched TV until our parents came home. We didn't tell them about the man since he hadn't really tried to harm us. Now when I think back to this, I wish we had called the police because maybe we would have been able to prevent a murder. You see, the next day, we found out that the elderly woman who had lived a few houses down from us had been brutally murdered. Her neighbour had found her lying on her front porch, covered in blood. She had been stabbed multiple times in the chest and neck. My brother and I immediately knew who had done it, and we told the police what we knew. They couldn't do much from the information we had given them, unfortunately, since we hadn't seen many details of his face. They went on the hunt for the man, but never caught him. I blame myself for that poor old lady's murder, because I could have prevented it from happening just by calling the police. I think the most disturbing thing of all is the fact that he didn't take anything from the old lady's house. Her house had been left untouched. But he could have gone in and taken what he wanted since her door was wide open. This means he just wanted to kill. That was his only intention. He didn't want money or jewelry. He had only the urge to murder. It was the summer before my senior year in college. My little brother, always interested in military stuff, had gotten a pair of night vision goggles for his birthday, and he'd left them at my apartment. One night I was bored and decided to go and try out the goggles at the wooded hiking area nearby. In retrospect, this seems like a very stupid idea, since I was all by myself, and female. But I was young and stupid, and I got myself all excited at the possibility of seeing deer and other woodland creatures in their natural nighttime habitat. I was familiar with these woods. My best friend and I had hiked there at night before, and we'd never run into anyone else. Our area is mostly rural and pretty safe, so I didn't anticipate any trouble. I parked in the little sparsely lit parking area, ignored the sign "Park closes at 10" and entered the woods, night vision goggles in hand. It was a half moon that night, and that was the only light that filtered down through the canopy of trees. It was pretty dark, and I didn't want to put on the goggles until I'd found a place to sit down, so I lit my way with the mini mag light on my keychain. A couple of times I thought I heard a little rustling in the woods a fair distance away, but it was nothing out of the ordinary, and I put it down to animal activity, hopefully the deer I'd come hoping to see. After I'd hiked in a fair distance, I found a fallen log to sit on and put on the goggles. I don't know if you've ever used night vision goggles before, but the effect is impressive. They can turn near pitch darkness into bright as day. Everything appears in shades of green, but quite bright and clear. For a while, I had a blast looking around from my fallen log vantage point. Some chipmunks played around in the leaves nearby, and a big owl blinked its lamp-like eyes at me from a tree branch. No deer though, and I started to think that maybe they wouldn't be likely to come anywhere near me, darkness or no, if I sat right out in the open on a log. So I decided to find a place where I could be a little more hidden. I made my way a little deeper into the woods, and finally found a huge tree, perfect for climbing. I've always loved climbing trees, so it was nothing for me to hoist myself up a few branches and settle in to wait for my deer. I didn't get to see any. What I did see, lit up in bright night vision green after about 10 minutes of waiting, was this. A man, dressed head to toe in dark coloured clothing, making his way stealthily through the woods. He was coming from the same direction I'd come, and was clearly trying to stay hidden. Moving from tree to tree and glancing around carefully before moving on again. It looked very much like he was looking for someone. It took me a few moments to notice that he was carrying something, and when I saw what it was, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. He had a knife, a big one, and was gripping it as if he expected to use it in the very near future. It wasn't deer hunting season, and this was a nature preserve where hunting of any kind was prohibited. And at any rate, the guy was alone and not dressed like a hunter. There were no deer in sight, and very few hunters kill their prey with knives. I was suddenly horribly aware of my situation. A young woman alone, weaponless, in the middle of the woods at night. This was the 90s, so no cell phones, and even if I'd had one, I wouldn't have felt safe using it lest I draw his attention. I didn't know how he was able to see so well in the dark. I guess his eyes had just adjusted, and I was terrified he would look up and see me. I sat there, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, and watched him as he continued his methodical and stealthy process of scanning the forest for who, or whatever the hell he was stalking. I scanned around but couldn't see anyone else, even from my high vantage point, and the sickening thought struck me that he might be looking for me. I remembered the rustling noises I'd heard in the woods when I'd first arrived, and then I thought back further and remembered something else. A white car that had followed too close behind me for most of my drive to the nature preserve. I'd been annoyed and a little freaked out at the time, but when I turned into the nature preserve parking area, the white car had passed me and driven on its way, and I hadn't thought anything more of it. Now I wondered, horrified, if this was the driver of that car, if he'd circle back and see my parked car, alone in the lot, if he'd come in after me. I sat, paralysed with fear, and watched the man with what felt like forever, but was probably another half hour or so. There was a heart-stopping moment when he paused right underneath my tree, and I was sure he was going to look up and find me. But he didn't. After a while, he seemed to give up on whatever plan he had in mind. I heard him say, "Fuck it," and he started heading back in the direction he'd come. The direction of the parking area. I stayed in the tree, wet with sweat and crying, until the sun came up a few hours later. Then I climbed down and, still terrified, gripping the little can of pepper spray on my keychain, I made my way as fast as I could to the parking lot. The man had been there. My windshield had been smashed with a rock, and someone had scraped all down the sides of the car with something sharp. Presumably a giant knife that I'm lucky didn't end up in my chest. Thank God for the night vision goggles that let me see him before he could see me. And thank God for big trees with sturdy branches,